Well, we're starting a new sermon series this morning on the book of Job. So I'm curious, how many of you have read the book of Job, all 42 chapters? Wow, that's great. How many of you understand it completely? Yeah, me either. Me either. I've never gotten to preach on Job, and always wanted to. So now we have a block of Sundays that we needed something, and so my turn has finally come. This series is called The Many Voices of Job, and each week I'm going to look at a different character in the story. This morning starts with Satan. Talk about something I've never preached on. Satan. You know, this is the most profound book in the Bible, I think. It addresses the most important questions of life. Why do people suffer? What is the reward for righteous behavior? What's a blessing? And what happens to blessings? What happens to faith when blessings go away? And I could go on. It's a great book. I'm going to enjoy this. I hope you do too. So we start with Genesis, the first chapter, beginning at the first verse. Listen to this story. It's got so many interesting twists. Many years ago, a man named Job lived in the land of Uz. He was a truly good person who respected God and refused to do evil. Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pair of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. He was the richest person in the East. Job's sons took turns having feasts in their homes, and they always invited their 3 sisters to join them in the eating and drinking. After each feast, Job would send for his children and perform a ceremony as a way of asking God to forgive them of any wrongs they may have done. He would get up early the next morning and offer a sacrifice for each of them, just in case they had sinned or silently cursed God. One day, when the angels had gathered around the Lord, and Satan was there with them, the Lord said, "Satan, where have you been?" Satan replied, "I've been going all over the earth." Then the Lord asked, "What do you think of my servant Job? No one on earth is like him. He's a truly good person who respects me and refuses to do evil." "Why shouldn't he respect you?" Satan remarked. "You're like a wall protecting not only him, but his entire family and all his property. You make him successful in whatever he does, and his flocks and herds are everywhere. Try taking away everything he owns, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord replied, "All right, Satan, do what you want with anything that belongs to him, but don't hurt Job." And then Satan left. Let me be the scholar for a moment. This is not history that we're reading. This is a novel intended to teach important truths. And we know it's a novel because do you know that the middle 37 chapters are poetry? Not history, not text, not prose. Poetry. We know it was written sometime in the 5th or 6th century BC, about the time that the Jews came back from exile in Babylon. It's important to note that Satan is not the snake in the story of the Garden of Eden. The Jews, up until this point, didn't have a conception of a Satan. They didn't believe in a devil until they came back from rubbing elbows with the Zoroastrians in Babylon. Evidently, the Zoroastrians did have a concept of a devil, and so the Jews came home with one. Now let me encourage you to set aside all of the movies you've ever seen that portrayed Satan. Forget all the books, all the stories, and you might even want to forget every sermon you've ever heard on Satan. And start over with this story. The Bible is a little confused about the role of Satan in the world. It was Wayne Bartlett's Sunday school class this morning that was discussing the temptations of Jesus. Jesus has gone out into the wilderness, he's fasted for 40 days, and then he is tempted by Satan. Satan's role is to try to get Jesus to do what Jesus really wants to do but knows he shouldn't. Satan is a tempter. But here in the Old Testament, do you see what Satan's role is? Satan's job is to protect God's honor. Satan's job is to keep people from taking advantage of God. In other words, in this story, Satan and God are not enemies, they're actually on the same side. We find in the first two chapters that both God and Job are laboring under self-imposed delusions. Whoa! Both God and Job are laboring under self-delusions. They're both kidding themselves about the reality of the situation. So God is holding court. There are all the angels gathered around, and Satan walks in as if he belonged there. Because he did. And they begin to talk about Job. And God says, "Isn't he wonderful? My little Job is so perfect." And Satan then points out the truth. Well, God, it's no surprise that he's so righteous and so perfect, because every time he does righteous things, you reward him and protect bad things from happening to him. Of course he's going to be good. Really, a self-delusion. Satan is accusing God and Job of what's known as utilitarian religion. Quid pro quo. I do something righteous and God rewards me. God rewards me, so I keep doing good things. On and on the circle goes. It's not about loving God or voluntarily offering a sacrifice. It's about paying your dues so that God will bless you. Utilitarian religion. You know it's still with us. Joanne and I play an interesting game called Parking Karma. She has the best luck finding a parking place. The only way, time after time, the only way she could get any closer to the front door would be to actually park in the store. I don't know how she does it. I keep telling her, boy, you must be a really good person for God to bless you in this way. You must have really good karma. Utilitarian religion. And you know, every time a natural disaster occurs, there will be some preacher someplace who says, and those people deserved it. New Orleans deserved it. The East Coast deserved it. When California finally sinks into the ocean, somebody will say they deserved it. As if the world was that fair. Am I the only person who has noticed that Sin City, Las Vegas, is still there? If God was going to give some city what they deserve, don't you think God would start there? We like utilitarian religion because it removes chaos from the equation. You and I are disturbed by chaos. We don't like the thought that things just happen. We want them to make sense. We want to have a reason why. We'd like to believe that everything that happens to us comes from God's hand, that it's a part of God's plan. You and I would like to believe that everything that happens is somehow a part of God's great plan for the universe. It's easier to believe that than to believe in chaos. We wish the world was fair. We wish people got what they deserved. And you know why? Because that means that good people like us would get really blessed, and the really bad people of the world, well, they get what they deserved, and the world would be fair. But the world isn't fair. It just isn't. It's worth noting that for lots of people, utilitarian religion is the ground floor of their faith. Do you have your seatbelts fastened? Because think about how often you have heard, probably from the pulpit, that in the beginning you and I were created to be evil, and that God could hardly wait to punish us. But that Jesus gave his life to God so that we could be forgiven, so that God could forgive us. Do you see it? That is utilitarian religion. Are you sure you want to believe that? Would you ever want the world to be that fair? Utilitarian religion is all around us. Watch out for it. Take note of it. Because it makes sense. But back to Satan. Again, Job and God are living under this delusion that Job's righteous behavior was Job's free gift to God. The delusion was that if God stopped blessing him, Job would continue to be righteous. Evidently, the ground floor of our relationship with God is supposed to be thankfulness. It's supposed to begin with thankfulness. Amen. Amen. But that's a hard one. Thankfulness is hard. It was recently pointed out to me that you and I live in a culture that teaches us to covet, to want what somebody else has. That's the floor of our consumer society, to want something more, to covet. You know that thankfulness and covetousness don't really go together very well. What goes with thankfulness is contentment. accepting that what we have is enough, accepting that what we have is good and beautiful. And that's tough. Especially when you take the thought to the next step, which is that you and I are supposed to be thankful even in the terrible times of life. Even when it seems we have been abandoned by God, even when it seems there is no hope, we are to be thankful and still live as God's children. Thankfulness. Are they right? Is thankfulness really supposed to be the floor, the starting place for our relationship with God? How are you doing with thankfulness? One of the things I find interesting is this whole business of the evolution of Satan. In the Old Testament, Satan is the accuser. There's a really interesting little vignette in the book of Zechariah. It's Zechariah 3, verse 1. I was given another vision. This time Joshua the high priest was standing in front of the Lord's angel, and there was Satan standing at Joshua's right side, ready to accuse him. That's Satan's job, is to point out the truth about us to God. To point out the truth. That's not very evil. But by the time we get to the Gospels, again we find that Satan is the tempter. There's an interesting little verse in Thessalonians where Paul writes, "At last, when I could not wait any longer, I sent Timothy to find out about your faith. I hoped that Satan had not tempted you and made all our work useless." Satan's job in the New Testament is to encourage you and I to do the things that we really would like to do, but know we shouldn't. And then you get to our time. In our time, Satan is the one we need to fear, the one who's wandering around looking for people to possess and make do awful, evil, nasty things. At least that's what all the movies about Satan teach, isn't it? Satan has evolved again in our time. So what do you think? Is there a Satan? Is there a personality wandering the universe that's evil, encouraging evil? Is there a person? I don't know. And I don't really know how to find out. I do believe in evil in the world, though. There is no denying that there is evil in the world and that people do evil things and that we seem to be able to do the most awful things to one another. There is no denying evil. But where does that evil come from? Is that from a Satan? My suspicion is that it's not so much an evil force in the world as the leftover instincts of our ancestors. Those leftover instincts that kept our ancestors alive. Like wanting to fear and repel people who are different, belong to a different tribe. That instinct to be selfish and to take care of yourself first. The instinct for violence. You know, those all kept our ancestors alive. But in our time, they're evil. I don't know if there's a Satan roaming the earth, but I know that I hear the voice of evil. I know that I have those encouragements. I know there are things I want to do that I shouldn't. So what about you? You hear the voice of evil? Is evil a reality in your life, or is it just me? Nobody wants to jump in on that one. It's wonderfully interesting to me to note that God's problem in this story is that God is far too loving and far too forgiving, and in fact so loving and forgiving that he can overlook evil. That God can overlook the truth about us. Even in Job, we're being drawn the picture of a God who is love, who really is on our side. We're going to develop that in the weeks to come. But notice, even in these few paragraphs, that God's on our side. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, loving God, God who is always present, help us, God, to see you present at all times and in all places. In the name of Christ, amen.